Mike Lillis will talk about what the White House and Republicans face from the replacement health care bill. And Chris Mim of the Government Accountability Office will look at waste, fraud, and abuse in government. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal beginning live at 7 Eastern Monday morning. Join the discussion.
Tonight on C-SPAN, Q&A with retired syndicated columnist Thomas Sowell. That's followed by Prime Minister's questions at the British House of Commons. And later, British Prime Minister Theresa May and British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson talk about Wednesday's terrorist attack outside Parliament.
This week on Q&A, author and Hoover Institution's senior fellow Thomas Sowell. He recently ended his syndicated column, which he had for 25 years, and he talks about his life and career and his love of photography.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, you wrote this at the end of 2016. Age 86 is well past the usual retirement age. So the question is not why I'm quitting, but why I kept at it so long. Why did you?
Why did I keep at it so long?
Yes, sir.
There were a lot of things happening that I thought ought to be explained in a different way from they're explained in most of the media. And I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed hearing back from people. I was sorry that I never had a chance to reply to them all, which would have taken up all the time I had.
I have your last column, and I want to just ask you why you put this in the column, and you can expand on it if you would like. My own family did not have electricity or hot running water in my early childhood, which was not unusual for blacks in the South in those days. What do you remember about those days, and where was it in the South?
Oh, well, I remember a lot because I didn't leave the South until I was almost 9 years old, and so I spent a fair amount of time down there. In most of those places, there was no hot running water. We had cold water, which many other blacks in those days did not have, by the way. But it sort of says where I came from.
You moved to Harlem. What was that like, and who did you live with in Harlem?
Oh, I lived with the same family that had raised me in North Carolina. Some members had gone up ahead and had been in New York for a year or so, I think, before we got there. And fortunately for me, they ran into a boy named Eddie, who was quite unusual for those days. He came from a highly educated family. He was obviously a very cultured fellow. And so before I ever arrived in New York, they had decided that this was someone I needed to meet because he could tell me things that they themselves did not have the education to tell me, and that this could help me in life. Now, at the time, I myself was not by any means looking ahead that way, but thank heavens others were.
Where is Eddie today, and what did he do in his life?
Well, you know, it's ironic. Last year, when on my birthday, I received a card from him. He's a year older than I am. He went on to become the dean of one of the colleges, and he's now retired, living in a very nice area. So it was quite a pleasant surprise. But my life really could have been very different had I not been introduced to him. And I would never have been introduced to him except that members of my family who were older saw immediately that this was someone who could be helpful to me. He and I never lived within a quarter mile of each other, and he was a year older, so I would never have been in the same class with him in school. But he was able to tell me things that I didn't know. For example, he took me to a public library for the first time in my life. And at the time, I had no idea what a public library was, and was really very dubious when I saw all those books and realized I didn't have enough money to buy one of them. But he patiently explained it all to me and persuaded me somewhat reluctantly to take out a library card and borrow a couple of books. And that was enormously important because it meant that I began to acquire the habit of reading on my own. Years before I ever would have acquired it in the normal course of events.
What kind of books were you interested in those early days?
Oh heavens, I remember reading the children's books, Dr. Dolittle, Alice in Wonderland, stuff like that. But the main thing was that I read and eventually simply got the habit of reading. Other kids from the same neighborhood in which I grew up odds were against their ever meeting someone like Eddie. It was as they were for me, except that others saw the significance of introducing us.
How long did you live in Harlem?
Until I was 20. I was 20 years old the first time I moved out of Harlem, and then I came back for a couple of years. So I grew up there from the age of just before I was 9 years old.
So besides Eddie, what impact did Harlem and your family experience have on you, other than the library?
Oh, I think a tremendous effect. I didn't realize it at the time. For example, when I was much older and had a son of my own, like most first-time parents, I wanted to know when he's supposed to do various things. And so I asked one of the surviving members of the family, how old was I when I first began to walk? And she said, "Oh, Tommy, nobody knows when you could walk. Somebody was always carrying you." And I was raised, as an only child in a family of 4 adults. So, whenever I got to be too much for one of them, he or she could always hand me off to somebody else. And I remember one episode in particular that was recounted many times in later years that Bertie, a member of the family, took me to a movie, and everything went fine. It was on a different part of town. It was only when we got back and I saw the house where we lived, I picked up some rocks and started throwing them at Bertie. I must have been 4 years old at the most. And in later years, she would tell that story and just laugh that, I was a little angel until I got back there. And in much later years, I've thought, you can take that attitude when there's one child and 4 adults. If it's the other way around, one mother and 4 children, it wouldn't have been nearly as funny.
We've talked before, and you always mention that you like to think things through before you either write a book or you write a column, and you're not in any hurry to have those published. How about this final column? How long did you think that through, and what kind of a message did you want to leave at the end?
Well, I did 2 final ones, but I don't think I took any longer than with the others. I mean, these were thoughts I'd had. I had thoughts of not renewing my contract in some previous years. But my wife always told me that, at the very least, you can blow off steam when things happen in the world that you don't like. But this particular time, I was off taking pictures in Yosemite with some photographic buddies of mine for 4 days. And in all that time, I never watched a television news program. We never read a newspaper. And I thought, this is the way to live. And the only way to live this way is to stop writing the column so that I don't have to be up to date on all the news. And that's the biggest benefit, that when I'm watching a television program and some silliness in politics comes on the air, I can simply switch to the tennis channel or turn to classic movies, or just turn the thing off. Because I feel no obligation now to keep track of things like that. And those kind of things certainly don't do my blood pressure any good.
I know, sitting on the Stanford campus in Palo Alto, do you remember when you had your first solid political thought or idea? Oh, yes, heavens. I was 10 years old. And it wasn't really my idea; it's what I had heard. And I had heard that Wilkie was for the rich and FDR was for the poor. And so my first political activism was going around tearing down Wilkie posters in Harlem. Fortunately, there weren't that many Wilkie posters in Harlem, and so I didn't waste a great deal of time on that. Did you consider yourself a Democrat?
I don't know if, well, at that time I was a long way from voting age, but for most of I was a registered Democrat as late as as the spring of 1972 for the last time. And since then I've never been a registered member of any party. That particular year I was so disgusted with both candidates that I didn't vote at all. And neither of those candidates seemed to be as bad in retrospect as the two candidates we had last year.
Let me go back to the column and ask you about this paragraph. Years of lying presidents. You're talking about could any president do anything like that today, meaning it was John F. Kennedy you'd been writing about and the Soviet Union and the trust that people had in the president then. But you say then years of lying. Democrat Lyndon Johnson and Republican Richard Nixon especially destroyed not only their own credibility, but the credibility which the office itself once conferred. The loss of that credibility was a loss to the country, not just to the people holding that office in later years. Why did you consider both Johnson and Nixon presidencies as lying presidencies?
Well, Nixon's the easiest one. I mean, he lied obviously about Watergate. But in retrospect, I think the fact that Nixon was so obviously lying, I regard as almost a virtue. That is, when you saw him on television saying things that turned out to prove to be false, you could see him sweating and so forth. I mean, it didn't take any great insight to know that he was lying even before the evidence came out. With Lyndon Johnson, my gosh, there were so many things he said. He got us into this the Gulf of Tonkin resolution later on turned out to have been by something that was completely overblown in order to give him power to go to war. But at the crucial time in that war, after the Tet Offensive of 1968, the media all said that this uprising of communist guerrillas in South Vietnam will show that our policies had failed, that the communists had won. It so happens that later evidence, including statements by communist leaders themselves after they had conquered Vietnam, was that the American troops had actually wiped out the Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam, and that they were never a serious force thereafter. But what came through the media was that the Viet Cong guerrillas had succeeded, that they had inflicted a terrible loss on Americans, and that the war was unwinnable. Now, if the public thinks the war is unwinnable, that will in fact make it unwinnable. And Lyndon Johnson came on the air, told the truth, perhaps a rare thing for him, and yet he was not believed. And all those in the media who were putting forth what turned out to be completely false stories were believed, and therefore all the 50,000 Americans who lost their lives in Vietnam, winning victory after victory, all of that went down the tubes because the president didn't have credibility when he needed it.
What's been the impact of the Vietnam War and the Watergate years on this country?
Oh, no question, a great cynicism about the public. If I may go back to John F. Kennedy in 1962 at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I was never a big fan of President Kennedy, and he won very narrowly in 1960. But when he came on the air and told us that the Russians were going to put nuclear missiles 90 miles from the United States, and that he was taking us to the brink of nuclear war to stop them, I thought, you know, he's president. I mean, he's got to do what he's got to do. And it was a very tense time. I was teaching at the time, and I remember when I was giving out the assignment to the students in class, I said, you know, the assignment for next week, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying, if there is a next week. I know, but there was that kind of confidence. I don't recall anybody raising any fuss with this man for taking this step that really could have been the death of millions, as he well knew. Today, I don't think any president of the United States in the last 30, 40 years could go on the air and do that and have the public behind him. And that's not a problem for him. That's a problem for the country. If you have a president, he has to have the public support not for his sake, but for the public's sake.
Do you remember how you felt about Watergate in the middle of it all?
Yes. Someone was trying to get me to accept a presidential appointment in the Nixon administration, and they asked me to send them my vita. And I have to tell you, in order to prevent you from being embarrassed, that I'm very disturbed about what's coming out about Watergate. And at some point, I may find it necessary to criticize the President of the United States. And the guy at the White House said to me, Tom, if we let that stop us, we never will get these jobs filled. Phil, send us your resume.
And what'd you do?
No, I decided I didn't want the job anyway.
You know, while you're on that, we've got some video of you back in our talk in 2005, talking about an offer you had in the Ford administration. And as people listen to this, they have to keep in mind when you're telling this story that there was a Democratic Senate at that time. Let's listen to this, and you'll see what you said back in 2005. Which president offered you the Federal Trade Commissioner's job?
President Ford.
What were the circumstances?
They had a vacancy. It was 1976, and they offered it to me, and I agreed to take it on condition that if there's any opposition that arises, they let me know. I'll withdraw because I don't have time to play Washington games. And I kept calling there and asking the guy at the White House who's handling this, is there any, I don't hear anything, what's going on? And he said, oh, no, it's just taking time. And eventually I was in Washington, so I went up to the Hill and talked to the staffer of this committee that handled this. And he said, we've gone over your record with a fine-tooth comb. We can find nothing to object to. And therefore, we're just not going to hold hearings. Because this is an election year, we expect our guy is going to be elected, and he'll appoint his own man. What burned me was that he said, and I said, did you tell the White House this? He said, we told the White House this months ago.
And would you have taken that job had they cleared you in the Senate?
You mean after learning this?
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, if the process had moved faster, had you agreed to go to the Federal Trade Commission?
Yes, I would have, reluctantly, but in fact, the first time it was offered to me, I said no, but they came back again. And in the meantime, someone whom I knew said, Tom, you're always criticizing the Federal Trade Commission. Here is your chance to be one of the commissioners. And I thought, I really should then. So I would have taken it, but it was not something I look forward to. It meant moving. It did not mean any increase in pay, but it did mean an increase in cost of living and so on. So I mean, there were many downsides for me personally. But I thought that really, as a matter of living up to what I've been saying, I ought to go and try it.
Now, your first job in government, though, was considerably earlier than that, and what was it?
Oh, I was a GS2 clerk in the General Accounting Office back in 1950. And that was a big step up for me at the time.
That means that you were GS2. They start at GS1 and go up to GS18. I don't know if they still do 18, but they do the senior executive service. Why had you gone in the government, and what impact did those years have on your thinking today?
Well, you mean the years before or the year after?
Afterwards, yeah, after you had the experience of working in the government.
It was not habit forming. There was a lot of double dealing and stuff going on, but by the time this is before I was drafted and went into the Marine Corps. But after I came out, went back eventually to that job. But now I realized I had the GI Bill to back me up, and that I would now try to go to college, and so I never regarded that as a career thing. I just, it was something I would do. And that gave me a great deal of freedom, because for one thing, there's one example of the freedom. Back in those days, the General Accounting Office had a large unit that was essentially all black. And it was presided over a white woman from Georgia. And they had different rules that when in other units, if you were late, you signed a T for tardy. But in the unit that I was in, if you were late, they docked you an hour's annual leave, and you signed for it. Since I was planning to leave when the time was right, and I was going to turn in my annual leave for money, I was not about to sign for that. And I told them, quite frankly, that not only was I not going to sign, that if they took the leave without my signing, I would take the case right up to the Civil Service Commission. They immediately realized that they knew they were wrong to begin with, but they realized if I did that, all hell would break loose. And so, in one of those wonderful political compromises, they would let me sign a T for tardy, and everybody else had to sign for an hour's annual leave. And that deprived me of any standing to bring any case. I told the others, but they wouldn't believe me. Many of them felt I must have some secret in, I must know somebody or something. But that was the way it was. The other thing was, the other people were career civil servants, and so they knew not to make waves. I really didn't care because I wasn't planning to be there that long.
Did you ever ask anybody then why in the world they would have two separate, ideas about if somebody was late, why they would do one with the whites, one with the blacks?
No, because I mean, I think if you put a white woman from Georgia in the 1950s in charge of a black unit, that's what you expect to happen.
Talking about your last words that you wrote, at least in your columns, was it Creative Services? Creators Syndicate. Syndicate, I'm sorry. You say the first column I ever wrote 39 years ago, and you wrote at the end of 2016, was titled The Prophets of Doom. This was long before Al Gore made millions of dollars promoting global warming hysteria. Back in 1970, the prevailing hysteria was the threat of a new ice age, promoted by some of the same environmentalists who are promoting global warming hysteria today. I tried to find that column on the internet. It's not there that I could find. Is it available for any of us to read?
Yes, it was published in the old Washington Star, which, as you know, went out of business some years ago. Hopefully not as a result of my columns. But there's a book called Pink and Brown People, which is the first collection of my columns that was published by the Hoover Institution back in early 1980s. And it's in there. Well, whether that book is still in print, I don't know. But
did you go back when you wrote your last column? Did you go back and read it?
No, I did not.
Well,
but I remembered it because it was my first column, and I had no thought when I wrote it that I would be writing regularly. The Washington Star had a feature where ordinary readers could write in and send in a column, and I sent that. That was the first time I ever tried it, and they published it as I wrote it, and so that was the beginning.
Your undergraduate degree was from what school?
Harvard.
But you started at Howard and then went to Harvard.
That's right.
Your master's degree was from Columbia?
Yes.
And then your PhD at Chicago. What was your dissertation about?
Oh, it was called Say's Law and Historical Analysis. And in fact, I wrote a very expanded version of that dissertation as a book published by Princeton University Press.
I got on Amazon and counted the number of, and just very quickly counted the number of opportunities to buy something with your name on it, and I think I stopped at 57, but I know those are all kinds of things, including essays, but how many actual books have you completed since you started writing them?
Oh my goodness, I've been asked that question. I've never actually counted them, partly because it depends on what you mean. There are books that are original books, there are books that are collections of previous writings, and so on, and they're monographs and so forth, but I've never really tried to keep track, but it's a few dozen.
At this point, which one of all those books sold the most?
Oh heavens, Basic Economics. Not only sells the most, in English it's been translated into 7 or 8 languages.
What would you say would be the most important thing, and I know this is a simple question, most important thing or things that people who read that book will learn?
Oh my gosh, that is tough. But I guess they'll learn what economics is all about, which is more than just the sum of the topics. And in the first chapter, I point out that economics really, I elaborate on a definition from London School of Economics, that economics is the study of scarce resources which have alternative uses. In other words, there was no economics in the Garden of Eden because everything was available in unlimited quantities. But I think in thinking generally, whether in economics or otherwise, too many people do not begin by saying, what are the inherent constraints of the situation we're talking about? And they act as if, you know, they're God on the first day of creation and can follow whatever policy seems to them best. You know, but by the time when each of us enters a world that is already completely elaborated and complex before we ever got here, and so you make your decisions within that context. And if you don't think of it that way, you can have all sorts of utopian notions. To give one obvious example, I hear from time to time people complain, you know, that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson condoned slavery. Slavery was there for centuries before George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were ever born. And neither of them thought that the office of the presidency had any powers to do anything about it. Lincoln was able to do something about it because he did so not simply as president, but as the commander-in-chief in a war. And what he did applied only to people who were in rebellion against the United States. But there was no basis otherwise. And so if you can't think in terms of what were the things confronting the people who made decisions, nothing is easier than to sit there today and say, oh, this should have been done, that should have been done. And that's not taking the past as it was. It's treating the past as if it's just the present taking place in earlier times. And that is not the case.
When Yale University took the name John Calhoun off of one of their buildings, what was your reaction?
Oh my gosh. By this time I had given up all hope for the academic world, and so practically nothing surprises me anymore. If we're going to again look retrospectively, whatever reason his name was put on there, it was there. And I don't know that anything that has happened since then has made Calhoun any better or any worse than he was when that decision was made. If you're going to go back, the first that you're so desperate for grievances that you have to go back into history to find them, that really says something.
We talked about the impact of Vietnam and Watergate on the country. What about the impact of slavery on the country?
Great, and in any number of ways. But the question is, the thing that always gets me is that the past, whatever it is, good, bad, or terrible, it's irrevocable. And the only thing we have any influence over are the present and the future. And nothing that we do. I was so pained to learn that apparently Angela Merkel in Germany felt the need to take in these refugees in order to help Germany live down the terrible record of Hitler. Nothing is ever going to change what Hitler did. Nothing. All you can do is do things that are going to have an effect in the present and the future. And the effects that her policies are having in the present have been disastrous. And there's no reason to believe that they're going to be any less disastrous in the future.
I want to go, go back and look at some video of you in 1987 testifying before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee about Robert Bork. It's about 30 seconds.
This may be the most important Supreme Court nomination of our time, not simply because the present court is so closely divided, or even because Judge Bork is the most highly qualified nominee of this generation, but because this is an historic crossroads as regards the expanding power of judges, which is to say, the erosion of people's rights to govern themselves democratically.
Why did you testify there, and what impact did the rejection of Robert Bork have on the rest of the judiciary over the years?
Oh my, I testified because of the gross distortions that were coming out. I was listening to the congressional hearings during the day, and I'd hear how Bork was, at the very least, racially insensitive, or actually opposed to civil rights and so forth. And then I would go over to the Stanford Law Library and check out Judge Bork's record and his record before he became a judge. And I discovered in those files amicus curiae papers filed by Judge Bork repeatedly on the side of black civil rights organization. I learned that no civil rights advocate had ever lost a case in Judge Bork's court. And I was already familiar with Bork's record before I even looked into the law, because I was teaching economics, and I often read things that he wrote about antitrust law, which were brilliant things. And so an enormously intelligent man, an enormously decent man, and all sorts of utter filth was brought up. One being, for example, that he worked for big corporations, you see, because money was more important to him. And Bork was an academic, which is not a big bucks enterprise to get rich quick, and a government official, of which the same could be said. And at the particular time he went to work at a high salary in business, his wife was dying of cancer, and he wanted to have the money to make her last days as comfortable as he possibly could. And for that to be turned into some kind of cheap political charge was just truly despicable. More than that, the difference of one man on a Supreme Court that's divided is enormous. And every time I read an opinion by Justice Anthony Kennedy that is wishy-washy and incoherent in some cases, I think that's the price of defeating Judge Bork.
So,
because he was sent in to replace him.
What else is your take on the Supreme Court today, just as an institution after all these years?
Oh, it's very dicey, and what's dicey are the freedoms that depend upon whether the courts enforce the Constitution or whether they go off on their own social adventures. I think the greatest disappointment with this court was Chief Justice Roberts disregarding the 10th Amendment and finding some terribly clever way of evading it and declaring Obamacare constitutional. You know, the 10th Amendment says that the government has only such powers that are specific, the federal government has only such powers as are specifically designated to it, and all other powers either belong to state governments or belong to the people themselves. There is no power for the federal government to tell people what kind of medical insurance they have to buy, even if they prefer something else. But because I have no idea what terribly clever reasons the Chief Justice might have had, but once you knock down the 10th Amendment, there's really nothing the government can't order us to do.
Here's another clip of, we talked out in Palo Alto in 2005, and it's very brief, it's only 20 seconds, and I want you to give us your reaction to what you said then. What's the impact of 9/11 on this country and the world?
Oh my gosh, we will never be the same again. I'm disappointed in people who seem not to realize that it's not business as usual anymore. That it's really, there are things we have to do that we don't want to do, but the alternative is far worse.
That was actually 2005, and here we are 12 years later. What would you say today if the same question was asked?
I think I'd give the same answer, and I'd be more apprehensive today because the previous administration has now given Iran the go-ahead to develop nuclear weapons, and Iran is testing intercontinental missiles. Now, the thing that they're supposed to be preparing to do is attack Israel. Israel is closer to Iran than Boston is to Denver, all right? You don't need intercontinental missiles to attack Israel. You need intercontinental missiles to attack people who are on another continent. And there's not a great mystery as to who would likely be the target of it if they ever decided to go that route. And I think right now we're doing what was done by the Western powers in the 1930s. Hitler was building up his war machine. You're going from day to day, and you're taking the easy path and avoiding the hard problems on the assumption that somehow or other you'll muddle through. And they came very close to not muddling through. France, of course, was conquered during World War II. Sometime in one of my columns recently, it may have been one of the last ones for all I know, I suggested that people who want to understand what is happening in the world today should read a book called The Gathering Storm, which is not about today. It's about the 1930s. But once you see this kind of feckless drifting in the face of fatal dangers, you'll understand what kind of thinking is going on, or lack of thinking is going on today in the way that we're approaching the kinds of dangers we're facing now, which are far worse. Most people don't understand that for the first 3 years of World War II, the Western powers never won a single battle, literally, either in Europe or in Asia. They were beaten time and time again because the pacifists had gotten their way in the 1930s and prevented an adequate buildup of military forces, for which men paid their lives in those early years of World War II. Fortunately, at some point, the West learned their lesson. The United States entered, and with tremendous productive capacity, was able to supply itself, Britain, and the Soviet Union with the power of the weapons needed to defeat the Nazis and later the Japanese. But we're not going to have that kind of time in a nuclear war. You're not going to have 3 years to muddle around and get beaten and then come back. You will be lucky if we have a year to get beaten and still come back.
The Gathering Storm, as you said in that late column in December, was written by Winston Churchill. Is there anybody today, in your opinion, besides what you just said, that is suggesting that we ought to worry about the Gathering Storm in public life?
Oh, there are people who oh, you mean holding some official position?
Yeah, I mean, are there people that you respect?
Not that I've noticed. I mean, you don't get two Winston Churchills in one sentence in one century. Ronald Reagan would be the closest analogy, but of course he too is gone. Again, we never seem to look at what are the inherent constraints within which you're operating, and what can you do within those constraints. I think of Reagan, when the Soviets started building up nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, pointing at Western Europe. And Reagan responded by sending in American nuclear weapons in Western Europe, pointing at Eastern Europe. People were horrified and said, this man's going to get us into a war. We'll be annihilated. And fortunately, he disregarded them completely. And instead of getting us into a war, he brought the Cold War to an end. People who lived through the Cold War, with the fear of nuclear annihilation hanging over us all that time, have no idea what a feat that was. And he did it without firing a single shot at the Soviet Union. But he was never, I don't think he was ever considered for a peace prize. You don't get a Nobel Peace Prize for having produced peace. You get a Nobel Peace Prize for saying the kinds of things that people who are on the Nobel Committee think are going to promote peace, even though those things, such as the policies of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain in the 1930s, said, which led to war.
Since you've been retired from writing your column, how closely have you paid attention to what's going on in this country and the world?
Oh, not nearly as closely as before. None of it is truly encouraging, however. Well, I won't say that. I think the new administration in Washington has some very good people, better than I think most recent administrations have had in the top positions. The only question is whether the president listens to them, and that we won't know until a lot more time has passed.
I want to change. I want to completely change what we're talking about to something that you seem to enjoy, and it's important to you. As you mentioned, when you took your 4 days off and went to Yosemite with your friends and did your photography. How long have you been a photographer? Because you have this on your website, and we're going to show some in a moment. But how long have you been doing photography?
I took my first picture in 1950. And then when the results came back to the drugstore, I was just hooked from that point on. Previously, I had been thinking of becoming an artist. I used to do a lot of sketching and so forth, and so I had a sense of design and art and so on. And then when I was in the Marine Corps, the Marines sent me to the Navy's photography school at Pensacola Naval Air Station. And then there I got a professional training in the subject. And then when I got out and I was going to went away to Harvard, I worked for the University News Office as a photographer in order to help pay the bills. And so it was the perfect job because it was something I could do whenever I had the time, not just the taking of pictures, but when the photographer in charge, he always had more negatives than he had time to print them. And so if I happened to be awake at 2 a.m. for some reason and wasn't going back to sleep, I could go over to the news office, let myself in and print all the negatives that he had sitting there on his desk and leave it on the desk for him and tell him my time so I'd be paid. So it was a great job.
Well, for the audience, I can see you. You can't see me, and you're not going to be able to see these pictures, photographs. But I want to throw one up on the screen. I know you've got a list of what we're going to look at. The first one, I think, is Yosemite. It's is that El Capitan?
That's El Capitan. It was taken with a 4x5 Linhof camera and probably a 75 millimeter wide-angle lens.
When did you take that?
That I don't remember, but it was before I went digital, so it was probably towards the end of the 1900s.
And the next photo is a waterfall. Do you remember that from the list?
I think it's Yellowstone, Lower Yellowstone Falls in Yellowstone National Park.
It appears it's black and white, and how much?
Black and white. Then it was not Yellowstone. Yellowstone was in I know. Heavens, that would be Yosemite Falls, in the winter, I believe, because I think there's snow on the ground.
And how much of what your photography is black and white and color?
Uh huh.
Do you like black and white or color when you're doing your photography?
I like both, but when I was doing film, most of it was black and white, and now that I'm digital, most of it's color. A color film can be very delicate, and so when I traveled with color film, I had to take along a cooler that I could plug into the car to keep it cool while I was traveling, and then I'd have to plug it into a hotel room outlet when I got there, because the colors will change if you let the color film sit out in the warm weather. But fortunately, with digital, it doesn't make any difference.
The third photo is a young lady sitting on a chair. She looks like she's about 3 or 4 years old. Do we know who that is?
I know, but I'm not going to mention her name. But she is now a retired lady.
When did you take this picture?
Back in the 1950s, I believe. In fact, I'm almost certain it was before. No, I know it. It was probably after I went into the Marine Corps, because I know it was taken. I know what camera I took it with. It was a Bush Pressman, and I know the lens and so on. So that would have been still in the early 1950s.
Is there any way of calculating how much you have? I mean, I don't need to know the dollar amount, but have you spent a lot of money, a lot of your extra money that you have on photography over the years, and has it been an expensive hobby?
It's really my only extravagance. I'm not big on clothes or other luxury. My wife doesn't wear jewelry and stuff, so this is the only thing. I will say that when I finally decided to go completely digital and sold all my photographic equipment to a local camera store, they paid me over $10,000 for what was, at that time, used equipment, some of it obsolete. So I must have spent an awful lot more than that when I bought it originally.
Here's a photograph of kids playing on the beach in the water.
Oh yes.
Where's that?
That's the Santa Monica Beach in Southern California. The camera was a twin lens reflex called a Mamiya 330.
And
I was probably on the boardwalk, the Santa Monica boardwalk, looking down at them, and I saw the picture and just took it.
What have you done with all your photographs? Have you cataloged them all, and you're going to give them to somebody?
No. Well, I have negatives. I have a few that are prints. Of course, most of them, the ones I really like, I have hanging on the walls in my home. So, but I have the negatives, a tremendous number. My first negative in my file was taken in 1948 of people picketing the White House when Truman was president.
And over the years, how many different kinds of cameras have you used?
Oh my gosh. At one time, I had a dozen cameras simultaneously. So this will give you, and there's obviously been a turnover. Today, I struggle along with just 6.
What kind of cameras now?
I do most of my pictures with two Nikon D3Xs. And then I have a couple of Sony cameras, and a couple of others miscellaneous.
Here's a photograph.
But,
here's a photograph of a gentleman painting with a beret on and a cigar in his mouth. Where's that?
Oh yes, that's Greenwich Village, 1952, and the camera was a Rolleicord.
When you take a picture of somebody like this, do you have to get their permission to use it?
I hope not, because I didn't get his permission.
Here's an aerial shot of, it looks like Niagara Falls, and my first question is, how did you get this picture?
From a helicopter. Now, sometimes I've chartered a helicopter just for this purpose, but in this case, they happen to be an already existing helicopter service, and so I just got on it for the heck of it, and he flew around Niagara Falls, and I simply shot the picture out the window.
Have you sold any of your photographs?
Not really. I've some of them have been published. There was a picture I took of a lady who was an academic, and someone did some kind of feature about her, and they requested a copy of this photograph. I'd given it to the lady in question, and when they were interviewing her, they asked if they could use it, and so I said, sure, go ahead. I put one on the cover of a book of mine. Unfortunately, that book was out of print inside of a year, and so it got very little exposure.
Want to show a photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge and cars coming across it, and again, the same question, from what angle, how did you get this photograph?
Well, there's an observation area near the Golden Gate Bridge, and I had my Nikon D3Xs, and I have a 200 to 500 millimeter telephoto, and I used that to take that particular picture.
What are you looking for when you do photography?
I'm looking for something that makes an interesting scene, and when I see it, I simply go take it. Sometimes I pre-plan, and looking through old pictures of Yellowstone National Park before I ever went there, I saw a picture of the lower Yellowstone Fall, and I thought, my gosh, I'm sure I could take that picture better than that. And when I went there, I set it up, and I think I did take a better picture than that. My wife tells me that I was there for 2 hours. Fortunately, she brought along a large book to read, as she does on these occasions. But I was amazed when she told me I'd been there 2 hours, because I took the picture from every conceivable position with every conceivable camera and lens combination.
How long have you been married, and where did you meet your wife?
I've been married 36 years, and I like to say that I got my wife because of affirmative action. That I'd written an article about affirmative action, which she read in Palo Alto, and she complained to a mutual friend that she really objected to what I had said and thought I was wrong. He said, well, he's right here in Palo Alto. Why don't the two of you get together for lunch and work out your differences? Well, we got together for lunch. We have not worked out our differences to this day, but things took a turn in other directions.
Does she agree with you politically at all?
On a lot of things, but of course, no wives and husbands agree on all things.
What would be your advice after all these years of marriage where you married somebody that didn't have the exact political views? How do you deal with it?
Oh heavens! I'm not one of those people that thinks that you go berserk because someone dares to think differently than you do. My heavens, no, that doesn't make it. It's pathetic that people nowadays think that the fact that they disagree with somebody is a reason to go creating a riot and destroying property, as at Berkeley just recently, the latest among any number of similar incidents across the country.
We have one last photograph, and that is an aerial view that you took of Stanford University, right where you are now. From what angle? Where were you when you took this picture?
I was in a helicopter that I chartered, and we simply flew over the campus, and took the pictures.
And after all,
obviously a handheld camera.
That tower that we see is the Hoover Institution.
Yes, it is.
Now,
yes.
You've been there how long?
Since 1980, which would be, oh my heavens, 30. My gosh,
it's about 36 years,
plus.
37 years. But how has Stanford changed since you've been on that campus?
You know, I am one of the least informed persons you could have found on what goes on in the Stanford campus. I took the job at the Hoover Institution rather than another job that was offered to me back east, mainly because by this time I was thoroughly disgusted with the academic world. I never planned to teach again. And the Hoover Institution was the perfect place for me because it would allow me a place where I could do the work that I wanted to do, and research and writing and so on, and have absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the campus. And that's been my policy the entire time I've been here. And it's been the happiest and most productive part of my career.
There is something, I wondered if you were aware of this, something on Twitter called @ThomasSowell that you did not start. Are you aware of that?
Someone told me that. I don't think I've ever gone to look at it.
He says, if it's a he says, I'm not Thomas Sowell, but I own all of his books and tweet quotes from them. And I'm going to read back to you a couple of the quotes that he has tweeted out to the followers. He's got over 87,000 followers reading your work. Here's one. It just says, most people who read the Communist Manifesto probably have no idea that it was written by a couple of young men who had never worked a day in their lives and who nevertheless spoke boldly in the name of the workers. Similar offspring of inherited wealth have repeatedly provided the leadership of radical movements with similar pretenses of speaking for the people. Was that your book on Marx?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I would have put things like that in that particular book, which was really a study of the history of ideas.
Were you ever a Marxist?
Oh yes, during my 20s. Fortunately, unlike today's left, I never felt that I had to avoid seeing what people with different views thought. And so during all my years as a Marxist, I read everything across the political spectrum. I have to this day a book on Burke that I first read back when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I treasured that book. I could tell even then. And so I understood that there were reasons why people have different views, as I see even today. That it's not just that it's not just a question of being on the side of the angels against the forces of evil.
Here's another tweet, and these are your words. Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get a sense of superiority by denouncing others as racist.
Yes, I suspect that there are millions of Americans who would be gratified if the whole subject of race simply vanished into thin air because they're sick of hearing about it. But there are people for whom this is a very lucrative business. I'm amazed at how little attention was paid to the fact that Al Sharpton, owes the federal government millions of dollars in taxes. You don't owe millions of dollars in taxes unless you've made millions of dollars in income. And the question is, how did this man, ever get into a position to make millions of dollars other than by race hustling?
One more tweet. You will never understand bureaucracies until you understand that for bureaucrats, procedure is everything and outcomes are nothing. If you have been living in a world where outcomes are everything, you may have a very hard time understanding bureaucratic thinking or practices.
Yes. I know from time to time my wife is amazed at some of the foolish things that are done by the government. But if you understand bureaucracy, it makes perfect sense. That I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I went on a trip in which I turned my expenses over to the university for reimbursement, and no one at the university questioned any of the major expenditures. But someone decided that I should not be reimbursed for the collision damage cost of renting a car from one of the agencies. Because Stanford has this clause that it covers that and so on. And I was so outraged that I went to the head of the Hoover Institution, and he had better things to do than this. And so he gave me a mid-year raise in the amount of the collision damage waiver, so that he could get this thing off his back. But those people who did that never asked, why was I there 4 days for this event? And the answer was I had a lot of other research. But I say there's no need to even say that. So long as they have paper, they're happy, and so they seize upon these little things that are utterly inconsequential, and let everything else go by.
You're not that far away from your 87th birthday. What do you intend to do with and this sounds like a crazy question, for the rest of your life? What do you want to accomplish? What's your so-called bucket list for the rest of your life?
Oh, I'll be happy if I can finish up all the things that I have currently going, which will be quite a project. Right now, I've already finished up the third edition of my book, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, months ago, and my assistants are so busy that they haven't had a chance to work on that and to put it into print.
So you got a book coming out soon?
Not soon, and I don't even have a timetable because I find the easiest way for me to work is to tell no one, not even my agent, what I'm working on. And when it's all finished, I then send the finished manuscript to my agent and then leave it with her, and she knows to call me back when she has an offer.
Our guest for the last hour has been Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's sitting on the Stanford campus where he has an office, but he writes a lot out of his home. And there's a lot to read if people are interested in reading a lot of your works or your books. And we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qand.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
If you enjoyed this week's Q&A interview with Thomas Sowell, here are some other programs you might like. Our 2005 interview with Mr. Sowell on politics, his books, and his views as a conservative African American. George Mason University economics professor Walter Williams talking about his life and libertarian views. And conservative radio talk show host Mark Levin discussing his career, his books, and politics. You can watch these anytime or search our entire video library at cspan.org.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. And coming up Monday morning, Washington Examiner White House correspondent Gabby Morengiello and The Hill's Mike Lillis will talk about what the White House and Republicans face from the replacement health care bill. And Chris Mim of the Government Accountability Office will look at waste, fraud, and abuse in government. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal beginning live at 7 Eastern Monday morning. Join the discussion.